Good morning, my friends. This is Paul, and today we're going to talk about my favorite book, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. And we're going to go in depth about the differences between the book, this masterpiece, and the movies, sort of masterpieces. Now, I know that the Deathly Hallows is split into two parts for the movies, because trying to convert this into a 2-hour-long movie, good luck. I mean, they did it with Order of the Phoenix, but that also had a lot of fluff and unnecessary details, whereas pretty much everything in this book is important. So, again, because a lot of YouTubers have already done this, and there have been quite a few comparisons where they talk about what's changed between the book and the movie, I decided I wanted to do it in a much more heavy-handed way, where instead of rushing through and cutting out what is and isn't relevant and trying not to nitpick over every single little detail, I decided I'm going to do this chapter by chapter, so this doesn't end up being like 2 hours long like most of these other comparison videos go. So we're going to talk about chapter 1, which is called The Dark Lord Ascending. We're also going to talk a little bit about the prologue to the book, which the movies don't have, which I think adds another dimension to the narrative. And so the next episode is going to be chapter 2. I may also bring up stuff that was already introduced in the previous books, but just the movies decided to leave out and shoehorn in at the last minute. So without further ado, let's quickly bring up the two quotes we have at the beginning of the book, which seemed so out of place when I read this to my sister. There's a quote from Achilles from The Libation Bearers and William Penn, More Fruits of Solitude. I don't want to read them to you word for word because, again, they do seem very out of place in the Harry Potter universe, but more or less they're talking about death and how it seems like death is so horrible, because it's pretty rare for people to die a pleasant death nowadays. But they talk about the possibility of another life beyond death, especially in William Penn's quote. He says they see each other face to face. And it's almost a paraphrasing of 1 Corinthians when St. Paul talks about how we look as though we're in a dim mirror, but then that mirror essentially shatters and we see each other face to face in heaven. So a nice little allusion to the fact that Rowling is more or less trying to present a semi-Christian narrative in this book. So the book starts out after this little prologue with Snape and another Death Eater, Yaxley, arriving at the gates of Malfoy Manor simultaneously. However, the movie decides that, one, it has to catch up on a major event that it missed in the previous book, and two, they wanted to make it more dramatic, because two men walking into a mansion is not exactly it doesn't exactly translate well to the cinema. So the way the movie starts is you've got the election of Rufus Scrimgeour as the new Minister of Magic, because Cornelius Fudge was telling the whole world for over a year that Voldemort hadn't returned, when in fact he had. Scrimgeour is actually willing to do something about it, because he used to be an Auror. The movie doesn't mention any of this. It basically just says, yeah, he's going to take things seriously. But this was unnecessary in the book because Rufus was already established to be the minister in Chapter 1 of Half-Blood Prince. So they waited a whole whopping book, or movie, chapter. Yeah, they cut Scrimgeour out entirely from the 6th movie, so they had to rush him in somehow with no avenue of character development. Then we have Hermione erasing her parents' memories of having a daughter so that if the Death Eaters came to interrogate her, then they wouldn't be able to squeal the information about Hermione because they don't remember having her in the first place. And she also implanted it in their minds that they wanted to move to Australia so that they'd be even safer because Voldemort tends to stick around Great Britain. This was in the book, except because most of the books from Harry's perspective, we don't actually learn about this until several chapters later. But we do know that Hermione did this before they came to pick up Harry, so it makes sense that it would be in the epilogue. And then we have a quick scene of Ron sort of looking off into the horizon while his mother and sister are cooking in their new mini house, because the burrow is repaired from the fire that didn't happen in the book. but yet the fire didn't completely destroy the burrow. So I don't know. I think that's just hinting that Ron is steeling himself for his mission. Whatever. So, finally, we get to the part where the movies and the books converge. Now, in the movie, Snape comes by himself, which I think is a good way of being dramatic, and also for Alan Rickman to show off a little bit, because this is really the only scene he gets in the entirety of Part 1, and then we have to wait all the way until Part 2 for him to make a reappearance. However, in the book, he comes with another Death Eater named Yaxley, probably because Snape doesn't really talk a whole lot unless if he's spoken to. So Rowling probably figured it would be too boring if Snape just walked in silence, so we want another wizard to give a little bit of commentary. It's also made abundantly clear where they are immediately, because in the movie you're assuming, oh, the Death Eaters just have a fancy headquarters, but both Death Eaters are well aware that this belongs to the Malfoys, and they know as much by seeing the peacocks strutting along the hedges. So it's very clear that this isn't some old random house, that it's Malfoy Manor. Now, this is mentioned in the movies, but it's so much later in the narrative that you don't get that impression when you walk into the cinema. Next up, we have the Death Eaters congregating around the rectangular table, just like in the movie, and we still have Charity Burbage suspended above the table. One noticeable difference in the book is that Charity is suspended upside down, whereas she is suspended horizontally in the movies. Likely this was done to prevent an R rating, because wizards tend to dress in robes as opposed to, shorts. And so she would have revealed her undergarments if she was hanging upside down, as I don't think Voldemort is the type that would make an anti-gravity spell on the edges of her skirt. It's also implied that Draco has a hard time keeping his eyes away from her, and this is where a little bit of subtext comes into play, because it's not explicitly revealed what Draco is so afraid of, but I think we can imply that he did take a couple of her classes, because it's later revealed in both the books and the movies that she taught Muggle studies at Hogwarts. However, we didn't know her name until this chapter, because the books are, again, from Harry's perspective. Harry didn't see the need to take a Muggle studies class because he lived with the Dursleys for 10 years before he came to Hogwarts, so he already knew everything there was to know about Muggles, so it was pointless for him. And Hermione didn't bother talking about it to the boys, so she just kind of became a non-character. Next up, the Death Eaters more or less proceed almost exactly how the movie does it, with them saying that, they have to wait and do proper timing to infiltrate Harry. Now, they don't exactly mention the Fidelius charm, or not the Fidelius charm, the blood pact, that because Harry's aunt is his mother's sister, that keeps her blood sacrifice alive, so that as long as Harry still lives at the Dursleys' house, he's protected. But that protection goes away the moment he's 17. The Death Eaters more or less just say, yeah, Harry's got protections, but just you wait until the right moment, and then we'll be able to strike. The irony is that they included Yaxley saying the same lines in the movie, even though he came with Snape at the same time. I do like how the actor that plays him is far more confident and scary. He has a really gravelly, deep voice, whereas it's kind of just said that Yaxley had a rough accent in the book, so it makes him have more of an intimidating Death Eater type of presence. It's also revealed pretty early on that Pius Thickness is not with them in the manor like he was in the movie, but rather he's currently at the Ministry working undercover under the Imperius Curse by the Death Eaters as one of many steps that they're doing to assassinate Scrimgeour and eventually put the Ministry under their control. However, they don't have a guarantee that the Ministry will have fallen by the time they go after Harry, but they're not too concerned about that because the Thickness has already made it so that the Flu Network and Apparition are being heavily monitored by the Ministry anyway, so Harry will have to move in the open if he wants to go to his next destination. So then we have that loud wail from the basement. And in the movie, Voldemort hollers at Wormtail to go and keep their guest quiet. Of course, in hindsight, we know that this is actually Ollivander. But in the book, Voldemort does it completely quietly in the same tone of voice as he's been talking the entire time. I think that was more or less Ralph Fiennes trying to make Voldemort unpredictable to make even the other actors on their guard. Whereas in the books, Voldemort doesn't really shout a whole lot. He's kind of like Snape in that regard, where even when he's talking quietly, he can command a whole room just by his presence. So next up is the idea of how is Voldemort going to kill Harry? He realizes, okay, I'm not going to leave this to any of you. I'm going to kill Harry, but I need a new wand. Now, in the movie, this is actually a really good addition to retcon the lack of foresight that the fourth movie had. Because after Harry's and Voldemort's wands connected in the graveyard when they dueled, in the book, Dumbledore explained that this was called priori incantatem. And basically, when two wands share a core, in the case of Voldemort and Harry, they share a tail feather from Fawkes the Phoenix. It causes them to regurgitate the spellcaster's last spells. So that's why Harry saw all of those shadows, because the wand was reproducing all of the murders Voldemort had committed. However, in the movie, Dumbledore just says priori incantatem and leaves Harry with a blank stare, like, huh? Okay, whatever. So, in the movie, Voldemort explains that when wands share twin cores, they can wound but not fatally harm one another. Good enough. If you're not going to explain all that hubbubaloo of what happened, at least you mentioned to the audience, who hasn't read the books, that something was up with their twin cores. So, Voldemort goes up to Lucius and he asks for his wand. And in the movies, I think more or less it's just because no one else has volunteered. And Voldemort's just like, well, I'm the decisive one, so I guess I'll pick it. But it's very clear that the reason he's asking for Lucius's wand is because Lucius was in charge of the group of Death Eaters that infiltrated the Ministry in the fifth movie and the fifth book to get the prophecy from the Department of Mysteries. And because Lucius completely failed and got himself locked in Azkaban, Voldemort's like, yeah, you don't really deserve a wand anymore, and you should be happy enough that I broke you out of Azkaban and I let you living in your own house. Malfoy still aren't really having that, but Lucius reluctantly complies. And then Voldemort taunts them further, saying, you guys are unhappy. You've been bragging about my return for so many years, and now you're all miserable. So, you know, yay for Voldemort not really being an empath. So then Voldemort turns over to Bellatrix Lestrange, who more or less has a crush on Voldemort, even though she's technically already married. The movies conveniently leave out that detail so that it can make it even more creepy. And even though in the movie she wishes to kill Harry herself, in the books she more or less is just so happy with the honor of being able to serve him. However, Voldemort decides to do even more of his taunting, where he says, oh, you're happy to serve me even though your niece just married a werewolf? So this is where the book goers get the explanation that Remus Lupin and Nymphadora Tonks are now married, and they're probably going to procreate, which they didn't really explain that well in the movies. So, I mean, it was implied that Remus and Tonks were in a relationship by the end of Half-Blood Prince in the book, but in the movies, none of that was kept in. So it's really good that the book sort of caught up the audience. And then Voldemort starts making fun of everyone else, saying, oh, well, I guess, Draco, you'll have to babysit the cubs, which itself has been discussed in a theory, saying that the reason Voldemort singled out Draco is because Draco is actually a werewolf. But that's a whole elaborate theory that would require talking about the other books, so I'll let you guys research that on your own. But basically, Bellatrix is just like, okay, our niece Andromeda, which is Tonks' mother, she married a mudblood, and so we're going to get rid of her. And so Voldemort's like, yeah, you will. when we are going to go get Harry, you go and get rid of those with impure blood. So then there's a lot of talk, mostly more or less the same as how it was in the books, of how Voldemort is disgusted with Charity Burbage because she was a Muggle studies teacher, and how she was encouraging the wizards to go ahead and have wizard-muggle relationships, whereas Voldemort is totally inspired by Nazism and is like, I'm not having that. We just gotta only procreate with wizards, which he's being kind of a hypocrite because his father was a Muggle. So, I don't know, maybe he's just mad at his own situation and is pushing his agenda onto everyone else. Charity begs for Snape to save her. In the movies, they add the nice little touch of we're friends to show that they did have an established relationship besides just being mutual teachers at Hogwarts. Then the killing curse is cast on her. But what I really appreciate about the movie is that they made it so that Voldemort was the one who cast the curse. In the book, they never actually said who killed her. It was implied that Snape did, because it said the body slowly revolved away from Snape, who kept his face impassive, which Alan Rickman did, although you could tell ever so slightly that he kind of sort of was sad that she died. Now, maybe I'm just an idiot, and I just did not pick up that it was Voldemort the whole time, because usually it says, Voldemort raised his wand, pointed at Charity, and said, but instead, after it said she turned her back to Snape, the words Avada Kedavra just appeared. Then again, the fact that Voldemort just casually says Nagini dinner afterwards and then the snake eats her body, I think the lack of surprise in his voice, instead of saying well done Severus, is pretty obvious in hindsight. So both book and movie end this chapter the same way that they do, with Nagini taking a huge, giant bite out of the body, which thankfully both the movie and the book leave the gorging to your imagination. So with that, we are done with our discussion of Chapter 1. Next up, Chapter 2 is called In Memoriam, where we're going to discuss a whole lot of stuff about Dumbledore's backstory that the movie left out. So I hope you enjoyed this series. If you didn't, well, I'm just going to keep it up anyway, because talking about my favorite book is so much fun. So I hope you guys will tune in for more. If not, well, just you can have another reason to watch someone else's YouTube videos. And until the next time, keep the faith, stay epic, God bless, and cannibalism should be frowned on. Bye!